Imagination that was the very ground of reality. Sweet reason was embraced by imagination. So many really great scientists are people of enormous imagination. Imagination is more fundamental than the subsequent spade work of supplying the equations, as it were. Yeah. And Plotinus indeed says that the chief faculty of the soul is not, as we tend to think, reason, but imagination. Jung tried to recast the whole tradition in psychological language. As Jung always kept saying, the gods became diseases. You know. All the gods and daimons are alive and well in the collective unconscious and willy-nilly influence our lives, whether we know it or not. The notion of the unconscious was sort of unknown before the rise of the rational heroic ego, which strangely insisted that it was the whole of the psyche. We don't get to know things by just cognition, by learning facts. We get to know things by being initiated into them. Existential, engaged, imaginative knowing, you know, that we feel in our bones. That's what we need, you know.
Well, Patrick, thank you very much for talking to us about very interesting topics. One of the questions I've been struggling with recently, especially, is science about intuition, imagination, or is it just pure rational thinking, logic, and use of method? And what is the role of the collective unconscious in that? You're a novelist. You have written a lot of books, and such interesting books as The Philosopher's Secret Fire, this one, which I recommend. I read it. And Daemonic Reality, another book we will also show at the end. And we would like to explore these topics and this question with you, and of course the larger ramification of that. So starting maybe with the other book, you wrote about the daimonic reality. What is daimonic reality, and why did you write the book in the first place?
Well, that's a long and vexed story, but when I was a young man, you know, I was trying to form a worldview, a basic, you know, so I could get a grip on what I laughingly thought of as reality. But I noticed that there was one area which didn't fit into my scientifico-theological, sociological scheme, and that was the appearance of you know, anomalous phenomena like UFOs. I was always very interested in supernatural events and so on. And I happened to notice that when I read this vast literature on UFOs and aliens and things like that, thinking, what the hell is going on here? I noticed their affinity with more traditional, what is called rather pejoratively, folklore, which is to say the tradition that's quite close to me, which is that of the Irish fairies, because I'm half Irish. Members of my family have seen fairies, and I was familiar with those traditions. And I noticed that that kind of tradition was continuous with UFO phenomena. And my dabbling in anthropology revealed that strangely, there is no culture which does not believe in these kinds of entities. I mean, you can go anywhere in the world and you'll find that these, whether it's the jinns in Arabia or the Quaishins in China, or the elves of Europe, or the Hulda folk and land spirits of the northern Scandinavian peoples, all over Africa, tribal peoples believe in what the anthropologists call spirits, although I think that's rather a misleading term. All the tribes of the Americas have analogous deities or entities or spirits or whatever. And I thought how strange that obviously these are real in the sense that people see them all the time. And if they don't see them, they believe in them. But the question was, what kind of reality do they represent? And so I started to delve into this, and I isolated, largely through studying UFOs and aliens and fairy lore, certain key characteristics or attributes of which I think are more or less common all over the world. That these creatures, these entities, are always very elusive. They're always marginal. That is to say, they prefer to manifest at marginal places such as crossroads or bridges or seashores, or at marginal times of day like dawn or dusk, or marginal times of year. Say Midsummer's Eve is a popular time where things seem to grow thin, as the Irish say, and the other world can manifest itself to us. Another of their characteristics is that they're shape-shifting, and that becomes very important in my subsequent philosophy of the imagination. What else? They tend to be always ambiguous, always paradoxical, always contradictory. That's to say, they could be both benign and malevolent. They're always tricky. It's like they're in the pay of Hermes. They're sort of trickster entities. The worst of their contradictions is that they are both material and immaterial. And that's very difficult for us to get our heads around, because we identify what is material with reality and what is immaterial with unreality. But these contradictory creatures can appear in a completely material form, and then poof, they can evanesce, they can disappear. Fairy would be a good sort of general name for all these entities, but in order to sort of lend a bogus air of gravitas to my explorations, I decided to adopt the ancient Greek word, which is daimon or daimones. And of course, the Greeks recognized, a vast array of daimones, fauns, satyrs, nymphs, dryads, hamadryads, naiads, and the Romans too. I mean, the Roman world was just filled with these entities. There was scarcely a rock or a stream or a grove of trees which didn't have its attendant daimon. Even inside the house, the lares and penates of the household were present. So I asked myself, what are all these things, and what do these characteristics imply? The interesting thing about the Greek daimones is that they are assigned in Greek philosophy to a particular place in the cosmos. It's a very beautiful place, and it's what they call the soul of the world. Now, the soul of the world is a notion that derives from Plato, when Plato's creation myth is a particularly lovely one, I think. The demiurge, Plato's creator god, looks into the world, the eternal world of the Platonic forms, the ideas, the forms of which everything in our world is a copy or a shadow. And he looks into this world and he molds and sculpts and cobbles together our world. He's an artisan, essentially. And when he's done that, he weaves through our world a soul, which binds it all together, which brings it to life. It's a kind of organic image of the cosmos, that the world is vivified, it is ensouled at its very inception, and so on. Now, this idea of the soul of the world was developed most successfully by the later Neoplatonists, particularly Plotinus. He saw the whole cosmos as being based in, grounded in soul or soul stuff. And that produced all the images that the cosmos is composed of. All the natural world are in fact images in soul, as are the daimons, as indeed are we. That kind of scheme is what it regards soul as kind of immanent in the world, or immanent, and so on. But Plotinus recognized that that there was another take on the soul, that you could model it in different ways, because it was itself imagistic and shape-shifting, like the daimons who live there, as it were, who inhabit it. You could also form it into a hierarchical scheme, a spiritual scheme, as it were, as opposed to a soul scheme. And in the hierarchical scheme, the soul of the world just intermediates between our world and the world of the forms, which Plato called nous or nous. And so our world is at the bottom, and then the soul of the world is above, and the world of the forms of nous is above that. And they all emanate, this is a metaphor drawn from light, from what he calls the one. So it's interesting that you can enjoy this hierarchical scheme, which is, as it were, a scheme that includes transcendence, that the soul of the world is transcendent to us, but you can equally think of it as us embedded in it, as it being immanent. And that seems to me to solve the conflict between transcendence and immanence. That it's simply a different way of imagining the cosmos.
Actually, what you're describing, the hierarchical sort of nature of reality, resembles to me a lot what I read in Kabbalah, and it started as one, and then it started dividing into two, and then further layers came afterwards. And
Yes.
And that also kind of fits into my own quest, why the existence started in the first place, why there is something rather than nothing. And then I found an answer a little bit in Kabbalah, which said, that when there was one, the nature of one was love. And it had so much love, but it was only one, but it needed to love somebody else. It needed to love another. And that's what triggered basically the division of the one and the hierarchy.
Of course, Kabbalah has many resonances with Neoplatonism and so on, and with Hermetic philosophy, which is another, which is also allied to, and together they form, that Neoplatonism and Kabbalah and Hermetic philosophy form a whole sort of tradition, what we now think of, or is sometimes called the Western esoteric tradition, which runs underground throughout our history. It's a sort of underground stream, which constantly runs counter to the established mainstream traditions, whether of the church, theology, Christianity, or whether of modern science, the orthodoxies of modern science. But it is notable that whenever it surfaces, it is always accompanied by a fantastic efflorescence of creativity and of art and ideas and so on. Let me give you an example. The first main showing of this stream was, in fact, in Alexandria in like the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, which was a wonderful melting pot. It was a Greek-speaking, a Hellenistic culture, but it was in Egypt. It was boiling with ideas. There were so many cults: Stoics, Epicureans, Neoplatonists, Hermetic philosophers, Christians. They were all boiling together in this wonderful flowering of a multifarious culture, all interacting with each other and so on. Of course, Christianity in the end triumphed, and instead of allowing these other ideas, as it were, to continue and to flower, it sort of pushed them down, repressed them, and declared them heresies, in fact, and so on. And so all these interesting traditions were pushed underground, but were revived at the Renaissance when the Greek writings were rediscovered, principally by, the Medicis in Florence, who commissioned people to go out and collect from the East, where they were still studied in Byzantium. They were still there, and he commissioned people to go and fetch them and entrusted them to his main translator and advisor, Marsilio Ficino, who became the kind of intellectual center of Florence, just as Florence was at the center of the Western civilized world at that time, and so on. So it was very exciting. And Ficino began by translating the Hermetic texts. He found those more alluring than the Platonic texts to begin with. But finally, he got round to the Neoplatonists. The striking feature, the thing that most attracted him to all these Hermetico-Neoplatonic texts was that they emphasized a strand in Plato which had been neglected, because as Kathleen Raine, the great poet, pointed out to me, Plato has in fact sort of two strands within his philosophy. There's the logos strand, which gave rise to logic, rational thinking, Socratic dialectic, and hence to modern philosophy and science and so on. But there's also another strand, the mythos strand, which is the strand which is when he addresses us directly with stories. Most of his teachings are done through the Socratic method, through reason and logic and so on. But sometimes Plato addresses us directly in a series of interesting myths, or as he calls them, likely stories and so on. And this Ficino understood as the imaginative strand. And Plotinus indeed says that the chief faculty of the soul is not, as we tend to think, reason, but imagination. And for Ficino and like-minded people of that time, it was imagination that was the very ground of reality. That this is an extraordinary idea, and not reason. Reason was absolutely permissible, but it was sweet reason was embraced by imagination. Imagination and soul are very closely allied. Plotinus said imagination is the chief faculty of the soul, but at the same time, it's also, you can only know soul through the images that it presents to us. It can't be known in itself. And so everything is kind of image. So you can say that soul and imagination are analogous to each other. When the project of creating a new cosmology, a new worldview, a new philosophical, universal philosophy, which was a combination of Hermetic, Neoplatonic, Kabbalistic thought, which was a wonderful sort of syncretic, synthesizing philosophy. When that project failed, due to various historical circumstances, not least the Reformation, once again, that tradition, the imaginative tradition in which I like to think I work, went underground again, was shoved down, and then was further shoved down by the scientific revolution in the 17th century and so on. And so it only emerged again in the great flowering that was Romanticism amongst the German Romantic philosophers, who returned again to Neoplatonic ideas, to the idea of a universal spirit, and especially amongst the English poets, notably William Blake, who was a great espouser of imagination. He thought imagination was the ground of reality. And it was also articulated by Coleridge and Wordsworth, and the next generation too, Keats and Shelley and Byron, all subscribed to the primacy of imagination. This again faded away. It was a sort of reaction to the Enlightenment, which they saw as giving up on sweet reason and becoming over-rational. Blake talks very sternly about the errors of Locke and Hume and Newton's sleep he refers to, and so on. And I think that really what they objected to was the rise not just of rationality as a sort of absolute principle, which denied imagination. The extremes of the Enlightenment started to say imagination is just the province of women and children, and and peasants, and the unlettered, and they dismissed all the wonderful daimons of the natural world and so on. And so Romanticism and the rise of imagination was in a sense a counter to all that. However, rationality prevailed, as we know. It was then allied to philosophical materialism to produce scientism, which is, well, I'll say nothing more about that. So there are these moments when, and I'm hoping for another renaissance of the imaginative tradition. The alchemists conceived of their art, which they called an art, and they called a philosophy and a science, gesturing towards the synthesizing nature of alchemy, which is a very, very profound discipline. It's a kind of an initiatory discipline, which I can't go into here. I've written a whole book on that as well. But they saw the alchemical secrets as being passed on from one adept to another in what they called an aurea catena, a golden chain. And I think the whole of the imaginative tradition is like that golden chain, you know, that it's passed on in secret underground away from the mainstream, except in these exceptional periods when it rises up again and produces wonderful art, poetry, thought, you know, and indeed it's as if the soul returned to the world for a moment and then was shoved down again. That's how I see it anyway. I was greatly helped in my personal quest by two key members of the Golden Chain, who surged up in the 20th century, and that was, on the one hand, the great Irish poet, W.B. Yeats, and the great Swiss psychologist, C.G. Jung. They were very like each other. Once you're in the golden chain, you're connected to all the other links magically. No sooner do you start investigating daimons, for instance, but then you discover romantic imagination, and then you discover its roots in people like Jacob Boehme. Well, Jacob Boehme also thought that imagination was the Urgrund, the very ground of reality itself, you know, and was terribly influential on people like Blake. And then, you know, backwards to Ficino, and then backwards again to Plotinus, and backwards again to Plato. So you're connected up to the whole chain, and both Jung and Yeats, in fact, studied all these different areas, these different disciplines. Yeats, being a poet, was more attracted to the model of imagination, whereas Jung tried to recast the whole tradition in psychological language and came up with his psychical hierarchy of, you know, ego, personal unconscious, collective unconscious, and so on. And in the collective unconscious, all the myths, all the original stories of the soul are alive and well, not just one or two, as Freud said, not just the Oedipus myth, but all the myths are there. All the gods and daimons are alive and well in the collective unconscious, and willy-nilly influence our lives, whether we know it or not. I should say a word about imagination, of course, and the romantic imagination that I'm talking about, that was articulated by Coleridge and Blake, that was subscribed to by Ficino and Plotinus, is not at all, it's almost the opposite of how we think of imagination today. I mean, today we think of imagination as kind of the ability to make things up, to invent stories, or perhaps to conjure up images of things that aren't actually present to our senses, you know, kind of memory. But to these magi, to these imaginative geniuses, it was another world altogether. It was like the other world of the fairies. It had its own laws, it was autonomous, it was dynamic, it was filled with daimons and with gods. It was what Coleridge called the primary imagination, on which what he called our secondary imaginations were based. And this implies that, you know, that imagination underpins our perceptions, that there's no such thing as a kind of simple sensory video-like, camera-like recording of the world. All our perceptions of the world are underpinned, informed by whatever imagination is in charge of us, as it were. Rather, as Jung says, that, you know, the unconscious is always present in our lives, whether we know about it or not. That's why the world of dreams is so important to the Romantics, as it was to, of course, depth psychology.
The intuitive mind is a sacred gift, and the rational mind is a faithful servant. We have created a society that honors the servant and has forgotten the gift. You probably know this quote.
Yes.
So, and we know that the way he came up with, you know, the theories that he has, the breakthrough, actually, science, it has had nothing to do with rational cerebral thinking. First, there was an idea, right? First an intuition, then an idea, and then he described it mathematically. So there is a rational thinking part as well, but it starts, I'm afraid to say, with the creative part, with imagination.
Which supports my view, I think, that imagination is more fundamental than the subsequent spade work of supplying the equations, as it were. Yeah.
You're talking about imagination as a manifestation within us, so to speak, sort of a local imagination. And then you're talking about imagination more like a field, like the world of ideas, which Plato describes. We go there, we fish it, you know, comes to us in a certain vision or into...
Yes. The three models that I'm proposing is the soul of the world and the romantic imagination and the collective unconscious. And I'm saying that these are all, if not synonymous, are all analogous to each other. They're different models of the same great mystery, the great unknown ground of reality. It's eccentric to place imagination purely inside us. And indeed, the Romantics didn't. They thought that nature, Goethe thought that nature was imagination, and Blake said, to the eyes of a man of imagination, nature is imagination itself. In other words, that it is both, in one sense, within us, but in another sense, it is outside us, all around us. So they make no dualistic distinction between, you know, the original Cartesian dualism between us, the inside world, and the outside world. Somehow, you know, these are one and the same things. You just have a different perspective on it. So you could talk about, you know, my imagination, but you can't do justice to it without talking about the kind of cosmic imagination. Jung similarly was eccentric in placing the collective unconscious, as it were, inside us. And he thought that the outside, that encounters with the daimonic, with which he was quite happy, because he himself encountered many daimons, as the Red Book revealed, including his personal daimon, who was a very strange Gnostic character called Philibon. He thought at first that these were all projections from within of the inside, that we projected our imaginative life or our unconscious life onto the outside world. But he later, through his studies of alchemy, realized that that was a false distinction. There was no sort of hard and fast distinction between inside and outside. He just thought that all reality was what he called psychic reality, which is exactly the same as my daimonic reality. And that to divide these two things up was a false way of looking at the world. In other words, he subscribed more to the old belief that there was a macrocosm, the cosmos, and that we are microcosms. And that, in other words, that we were the whole cosmos, but in miniature. So we were connected to the outside world, if such a distinction could be made, and it was, by being structured in the same way, that we were always connected, that we were always participating in the macrocosm as microcosms. So our individual souls are just individual manifestations of the world soul, which is an uncomfortable idea in the sense that if everything is, you know, if the world soul is composed of images, that we ourselves are images within that world soul. And I would argue that the central vice of the scientific revolution was to introduce an absolutely overweening literalism. In one sense, my book, The Secret Fire, is an attack on literalistic thinking. And what it means is that it only allows of one interpretation. Its literal mindedness takes all the great stories of the soul, like the myths, and says they're untrue because they're not factually true. In the imaginative world, there is no hard and fast distinction between the metaphorical and the literal. But myths are true stories, not so much because they're both literally true and metaphorically true, or only metaphorically true. They exist in a realm, in the realm of imagination, which precedes the division into literal and metaphorical. That we think of literal interpretations and metaphorical interpretations as being different, but that division was subsequent upon the rise of literalism. Literalism tends to dismiss everything that the imagination holds sacred as just fictions, only metaphors, as if metaphors had no force in the world. Well, I think the world is primarily, I think the universe is one great collection and bundle of metaphors, of images. So we're trapped in that paradox whereby images are real as long as they're understood to be images, but they're unreal if you take them literally. And I know that's a paradox that no one will understand, but there it is. The notion that science, the scientific worldview, is dismissive of all the things that the soul holds dear, the soul itself, imagination, the products of imagination, which are not only the daimons, but the narratives that myths have an incredible conformity of stories, you know, the quest of the hero, the slaying of dragons, the rescuing of maidens, the journey into the other world to retrieve treasures. Those sort of motifs are common in all myths and tell us something real about the way in which our souls transform themselves in the course of a lifetime, so on, through many initiation, through rites of passage. Only our modern scientific way of thinking denies the imagination altogether as a real force. It doesn't realize that it is itself a way of imagining. And that is why, as you pointed out, so many really great scientists are people of enormous imagination who conceive of some idea, some scheme, some Einsteinian revisioning of the cosmos intuitively and imaginatively before they do the spade work, before they write the equations and work it all out. And so, you know, science itself confirms the priority of imagination in that way, while in its everyday manifestations denies the importance of imagination and denies the importance of myth, and completely ignores or poo-poos manifestations of the daimons and so on. And I would argue that while the daimons are still seen regularly by the common people, by us all, in the form of straight weird animals like Bigfoot, like black panthers all over Britain, lake monsters. There's hardly a lake in the world that doesn't have a monster in it. UFOs, aliens, all these things. They also, being shape changers, they also infest the very disciplines that were designed to exclude them. For example, just as materialism was at its height in the mid-Victorian period, suddenly there was a wild craze for spiritualism. You know, it's like there was what Jung calls an enantiodromia, where one extreme turns into its opposite. And it's hard to overestimate the way in which spiritualism, which started in the 1840s in America, swept through Europe. All the great minds of Europe attended seances, and they were spectacular. You know, they had materializations, ectoplasm, objects flying around, things flying through walls, tables tilting and flying about. There was some element of fakery in that, but most of it wasn't fake. When Sir William Crookes was sent by the Royal Society to investigate these phenomena, which were essentially to debunk them, he spent a couple of years investigating rigorously, I have to say, he was no fool, and reported back to the Royal Society and said, I'm afraid it's all true. And they said, well, that's just impossible. He said, well, I didn't say it was possible. I said it was true. So that's one way in which the daimons, which had hitherto manifested themselves in nature, having been driven out of nature by the scientific enterprise, started to return in the genteel drawing rooms of Victorian ladies and so on. I would argue further. I would say that that we're always reinventing the wheel. That when you read Richard Dawkins's accounts of genes in The Selfish Gene, you know, they are the they are the elusive driving force of our sort of lumbering robot-like being. You know, they seem to have all the characteristics of that the Greeks ascribed to a personal daimon, you know, that they determined our destiny, that they were the blueprint for our lives and so on. All that was attributed to the personal daimon in Greek philosophy. Even Einstein's revolution reads to me very like the soul of the world. You know, I mean, I think I quote in my book a description of the cosmos being extended through soul, the universe being extended through soul like a net in water. And, you know, the net can only goes as far as the water allows it and so on. And that image could be straight out of Einstein, the idea of the universe extending through the field of gravity, you know, which itself, gravity, as it were, is curves space so that it is a self-bounding system. And imagination is like that. It is a self-bounding, self-limiting system. So it's almost like Einstein is reinterpreting in scientific terms a soul of the world-like model. In other words, I often think there are no new ideas. There are only repackagings and retellings of older myths and so on, just as Jung's collective unconscious seemed to contain his archetypes, the anima, the self, the wise old man, the eternal youth. He had all these figures who he empirically observed in the psyches of his patients. They're like a separate mythology, you know, that they're like the gods of old, but retold in psychological terms.
My parents had a book, Greek Myths. It was one of the best books I read. It was fantastic. And then I had a book of Romans as well. And when I started reading Romans, I got exactly the same insight as it's the same. That's it, you know?
Yes, well, they did.
And afterwards, I never got this feeling what I had when I was reading Greek mythology. So maybe there was something before that. Maybe there was ancient Egyptian. It's just we didn't get it. You know, the Alexandrian library was burned and you name it.
Yes, yes.
But at least because Greeks recycled a lot of that, obviously. But I've never had a feeling like, wow, you know, what I had after reading Greek myths. The rest was just like a variation on it, so to speak.
Yes, yes, yes. Well, I mean, I only emphasize Greek myths because we know most about Greek myths.
Yeah.
And the moment we found the Greek myths, they became the foundation of you know, Western thought. That education consisted mostly in studying Latin and Greek and the writings of the Latins and the Greeks. It's just that, you know, the indigenous myths of Britain, for instance, are just not very well known. We get inklings of what must have been a very rich Anglo-Saxon mythology in poems like Beowulf, which is quite an extraordinary Anglo-Saxon text, and also the amazing complexity of Greek myths, of course. That means not only are they incomparably well documented,
Yeah, beautiful,
incomparably
detailed.
complex and interesting. So naturally, we've drawn mostly on those and so on. But the world of myths, the gods of myths, are not like not like our Christian idea of God. You know, they are more like psychology. Mythology was ancient psychology, while modern psychology is sort of modern mythology. You know, even in animistic societies, which are entirely daemon-ridden, that they see everything as ensouled and indeed personified. The imagination likes to personify. That's why, you know, a tree is never just a tree, it's also a dryad. I'm not saying that they're humanized, I'm saying they're personified. Daimons are not human, but they are always persons, they're always presences, you know. All symbols are like presences, you know, they strike us as forcibly as another person does. And that's very important to understand the nature of the soul and the imagination, I think.
If we just go back to the personal daimon, because that's where it's getting really interesting, because people who experienced it at least once in their lives, they will never doubt it. and people who are most of them are in a creative type of work, right? So when you get in the middle of the night and you are driven to write, you can't sleep, you are not able to sleep, and you feel it's not you, it's just something else within you or some influence over you. You can only go back and do anything else once you've written it down, whatever was put upon you to write or to compose or to paint. That's experience people will never ever be able to, you know, deny. And there are many people who go to sleep with a question. They wake up in the middle of the night, they have to write down the answer somewhere on a piece of paper next to them, and they have it. Something they had no prior knowledge or experience with. So you cannot, you know, say intuition. Many people define intuition as relying on prior experience or prior knowledge, which somewhere they're sitting in unconscious, right? But what do you do with these cases?
So yes, the personal daimon. That's a special case of the daimonic, I would say. My own interest in the personal daimon came to me quite late, in that it was kind of forced on me, in that when I was reading a lot of anthropology, and I kept coming across time and time again the idea that when a child is born, there is some personality that protects and guides that child, usually an ancestor. The child often isn't named until it's established which ancestor is guiding that child, and then it's named after the appropriate ancestor. And this is extraordinarily widespread. It was completely accepted in ancient Greece. The most famous daimon of all time was Socrates' daimon. He referred to it often. It was interesting in that it didn't give him positive directions. It only ever said no. It only ever stopped him when he was about to do something displeasing to the gods. When Socrates talks about daimons, he said that he took the intermediate view of daimons. He thought they were intermediaries between men and the gods. He said that daimons convey the wishes of men to the gods and the will of gods to men. So he saw them as rather like the soul of the world mediates between the world of the forms and the material world that we inhabit. So the daimons mediate in our personal lives. And one should bear in mind, it's worth noting, I think, that the arch-daimon in Greek culture was Eros. That Eros was not the god of love. Eros, love itself, was a daimon. And it suggests that love is the great connecting principle. And that, I think, is true, that we tend to associate Eros with sex. But in fact, Eros is love in the sense of the principle of attention in us, which connects us to everything and everything to everything else. So it's not just tribal societies that so often believe in some form of a personal daimon. It was the Greeks. The Romans, of course, called it the genius. The genius was their personal daimon. So you didn't have geniuses. You had a person had a genius, and you would on your birthday you would toast and celebrate your genius, your daimon. So the two principal functions of the personal daimon is to guide us in our lives and to protect us too. And the foundational myth in the West, anyway, in Western culture of the personal daimon comes from Plato, and it comes from one of his mythoses, and he called it the myth of was a man, Er, and died and came back to life. He had what we'd now call a near-death experience, and he describes how before we're born, we are offered a choice of what life we're going to have, and we pick a life, and then we are assigned a daimon to make sure that we live that life. And so the daimon is very, very personal to us. It's almost like our souls. But at the same time, the implication is that it's assigned to us for life, but then it disappears and becomes the personal daimon to someone else. So there's a very paradoxical relationship between the personal daimon and us. And in Christianity, of course, it was called the guardian angel. And I don't know, I once read a poll that, something like 47% of people believe in some sort of guardian angel. It's an incredibly high percentage. Most of us are not very aware of our personal daimons, except, as you say, in perhaps moments of extraordinary intuition or some feeling of impulsion that we must do something. But Socrates says that just as the daimons connect us to the gods, there are certain people who are marked out as daimonic people. There are daimonic men and women in whom the daimonic is especially evident. It's like a vocation. And we recognize these people. They're shamans, mystics, poets, visionaries, mediums, all these people are kind of allied to each other in having a direct relationship with the other world, with the transcendent world. And in those people, they are particularly, I think, aware of their personal daimons in a way that us ordinary folk aren't. Yeats, for instance, was very aware of his personal daimon, and he paints quite a daunting picture of it. He said, my daimon drives me to perform the hardest tasks amongst those not impossible, he said rather wistfully, And Jung said the same. He said, I have a daimon who drives me ruthlessly to my life's task, and so on. And so you can see that the daimon is a hard taskmaster. It may easily clash with what you hope and believe is your best life. I always think of poor Kierkegaard, who I wrote a novel about, who was driven away from the love of his life, from earthly love with a beautiful girl. He was madly in love with her, and his daimon said, no, you have to give up the satisfactions and happiness of earthly life, because I have another task for you, which was to produce volumes of work before the age of 42. The personal daimon doesn't guarantee you happiness. Far from it. It can bring you great suffering in earthly terms, but what it does bring you is a sense of fulfilling your destiny, a deep sense of a meaningful life lived, even though that might mean crossing deserts, crossing the Badlands, might cause you all sorts of human suffering, because the daimon is not human. It doesn't care about human concerns. What it cares about is that you unfold the blueprint of your life that it has laid down. And it's a lovely idea that somehow or other that our lives are in some sense obeying a blueprint, a pattern, that we have a telos, we have an aim, a goal, an end in mind. And our task is to bring that into being, to body it forth, to realize it, and so on. So we're like little acorns when we're born, you know, and we have to manifest the oak tree that is concealed within. And so our will in this matter is much less free than I thought. There's a lot of wiggle room in this, you know, that the Greek idea of moira, fate. Moira means a portion. So there is only a portion of us which is perhaps determined in this way. So we have wiggle room and so on. But our chief trouble is that we're inclined to just go against the will of the daimon. And that, of course, brings a life of disaster, you know, that in some sense we have to conform to the pattern of the blueprint that the daimon has laid down. Sorry?
What do you think would have happened to Kierkegaard if he just didn't decided to? It was a crazy thing what he's done by any means of standard, modern standard anyway, that he just, you know, had a beautiful life ahead him with the person he loved and she loved him. And he just says, okay, sorry, cannot do that. I just go on my own, live
yes. Well,
and just work on my books, and that's it, you know.
It was just more powerful, you know, and indeed, you know, a person who disobeys their daimon for immediate what they want, for their immediate desires, it doesn't end well, you know, that they find that gradually their life becomes emptier and emptier and more drained and more meaningless and so on. I like the idea that that contra to the assumptions of psychotherapy, which have been in place since Freud, that somehow we are driven from behind by our upbringing, by our circumstances, which determine our future life. Somehow or other, our early relationships are tremendously determinant in our later lives and are often the cause of us getting stuck or, you know, getting terminally trapped in some sort of vicious circle. But the personal daimon model says, no, we are drawn from the future, drawn towards fulfilling or filling out the ground plan of our lives, that we are in fact in charge of our destiny by collaborating with the daimonic plan for our lives. And that is the way to not happiness necessarily, but certainly towards a deep sense of meaning and satisfaction and completion, a sense of wholeness, which is what the daimon wants for us. That's the idea. One of the interesting things is that in the myth of while he's looking at people choosing their lives before getting the daimon assigned to them, he notices amongst the throng is the great hero, Odysseus, who's choosing his next life. And he hangs back. Nearly all the lives are gone. You know, there aren't many left to choose. But he chooses, he's happy with his choice, and he chooses the life of an ordinary kind of landowner and farmer, that he doesn't want to be a great hero in the next life. But I think you can turn that round and you can say that, yes, that even in the most mundane person, there is a hero. Do you see what I mean? You can turn it round, that there is an Odysseus-like hero in each of the apparently mundane lives, and so that all our lives can be heroic and so on. And this is something that isn't much talked about, you know, that we look at the great geniuses and so on. And philosophy especially doesn't talk about. Iris Murdoch mentions this in one of her philosophy books, I think her book on Heidegger. She says that philosophy doesn't deal much with the lives of a woman who is married and has 5 children and leads a life of love, sacrifice, hard work, kindness, decency. That's a heroic life, but we don't really tend to pay much attention to it. But in many ways, that is the fullest and most satisfying and most wonderful of lives, you know, a truly beautiful life.
It feels like we are essentially instruments of nature, of a creator, right? And in the process of fulfilling our purpose, so to speak, or some destiny or fate, whatever you call it, we also enrich ourselves in a way, right? So our freedom is to go along or not. I guess that's where the freedom lies.
That's basic freedom. I remember being very struck by do you know Simone Weil? She's a remarkable 20th century kind of mystic, French, Jewish, devoutly Christian, but never entered the church. Extraordinary writings, and she said, I can't help but see a kind of hierarchy in the words chance, fate, destiny, providence. And I've often thought about what those words mean. You know, there is a kind of hierarchy, and I sort of providence is the point at which your will and the will of God coincide, as it were. And it suggests that I think there is a point where I think that when you die, for instance, it might well be revealed to you that your whole life was freely chosen, but at the same time, divinely ordained, an impossible paradox that it was. And I think that's what the meaning of providence is. It's a coincidence between your will and the will of God, as it were. And you can even get glimpses of it sometimes when you do something you really, really didn't want to do, but you did it anyway. And you see how it was providential, how it worked out for the best, that you were driven to do something in spite of yourself. But by the same token, you did also choose it. I think free will and necessity, freedom and necessity are seen to be an indivisible whole when the whole picture is seen. And perhaps we can only see that in the fullness, when we enter into the fullness of imaginative life, which probably only comes after death. Not always.
What about synchronicities? Do they play a role in this?
Well, if you subscribe to a world that is in which we are microcosms reflecting the macrocosm, if you think that our inner psychic life reflects the outer world and vice versa, and that they are connected together by psychic reality, by daimonic reality, by soul, then there is no problem. It wouldn't be a surprise that an image in your mind should in some sense manifest itself in the outside world, you know, and we do this all the time. We dream things, and then the next thing it appears in the world, or some image of it appears in the world, you know. It's because we're all embedded within imaginative life. And so every researcher, for instance, knows that a researcher is a quester. They're questing after knowledge. And sometimes you think you'll never find what you need. You go into a library and the book that you want falls to the floor in front of you, and sometimes opens at the right page. All researchers know, or someone sends you a book out of the blue, or you find a book on the tube, you know, something like that. You know, everybody knows that these kinds of synchronicities are angelic visitations. It's because your quest is so strongly constellated within you that the world around you colludes with you. It colludes with you because we're not separate from the world. The world isn't outside us in some sense. It's as much inside as outside, and the two co-inhere, to use an old theological term, that we're nested in each other.
You know, in some cultures, this type of sort of meaningful coincidences, right? We call synchronicity, that both positive and negative, such as bad luck, you know, when days when you can hold nothing in your hands, it's all keep on breaking.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Yes, and you're out of sync. Yes.
Yeah, and it's a minor bad luck day. They are all attributed to sort of daemons. Yeah, those are myths we're talking about, of course.
Yes, yes, yes. Mm-hmm.
Going back to Plato, world of ideas, right? Because he was saying that everything that was ever created was already there in a perfect form. And so essentially we can conclude then that if everything is there, we just go fish it and we discover it. So we create nothing new.
Yes, his doctrine of anamnesis, recollection. The idea is that we come from the world of the forms, so our pre-birth knowledge is vast, and we forget. When we're born, we forget. Yes, we don't learn, we recollect. I don't know. I think that's just simply true of my experience. I don't know about other people. That somehow, you know, if I want to write a book about something and I'm reading other books, the bits that I mark are bits that I think are true. In some sense, what I'm trying to say is already complete. I just don't know it yet. You know, that one recognizes things that are going to be useful to you and things that aren't, you know. And that is a bit like remembering things that strike you as true. Why would one thing strike you rather than another? I don't know. And I think it's related to the idea that we are already in some sense complete at birth, but we haven't unfolded ourselves. We haven't actualized what is already potential. And that relates to the personal daimons blueprint for us, you know, that we already kind of know. Like Picasso said, I don't become, I am. You know, he already was complete at the beginning. All he had to do was unfold that life in a series of visions, which were his paintings, as it were. So yes, I do subscribe to anamnesis, to recollection by and large, but you know, who am I to say? I just know that learning things is quite a strange process. It's more like, can we imagine this? Or do we have an intuition about the truth of this? Or are we driven to pursue this course by forces unknown? As you said so eloquently yourself, you wake in the middle of the night, you absolutely have to pursue something. That suggests that there is a kind of supra-personal drive within all of us. Yes, I do sense that learning is as much kind of remembering or recollecting something that I've forgotten, as much as just sort of grasping a completely new piece of datum.
I experience it more like resonance, like I'm playing piano, so I'm a musical person. So
Yes.
does it resonate with me, yes or no? That's more or
Yes.
less the way I go with it. So I don't go as far thinking was it a recollection or I just fished it from some other, you know, Plato world of ideas. But I do sort of test, is it true or not, by resonance, by internal resonance. Yeah.
When I was talking about Plotinus's central metaphor of emanations, worlds emanating from the one, the metaphor is one of light. The Romantics, their favorite metaphor was one of sound, of harmony and resonance. So the Aeolian lyre, which is played by the wind, you know, or else if you pluck one set of strings, another set of strings will resonate. That they used a sort of musical metaphor to describe the way in which our soul, individual souls, have an affinity with and resonate with the soul of the world, as it were. We are forced into these metaphors because we can't say what they are in themselves, naturally. You can't say what imagination is because you can't get outside it any more than a fish can get outside water, as it were, any more than you can see your own eyeball, you know, that it is already embedded in this great field, the imaginative field of soul or imaginative life.
I have a sense that what you call imagination, in terms of a field of imagination where we are immersed, it's almost feels to me like a field of consciousness. So do you use actually in your conceptual thinking, because we need to use language to explain things, right? We need concepts,
Yes.
that we can't communicate. So if we are conceptualize it, so is what you call imagination in a larger sense, is it what you understand as consciousness as well, or consciousness is yet something else?
Well, you know, I mean, consciousness is a popular word now.
Yeah.
Amongst scientists who have gone a bit off track, and philosophers who are beginning to embrace all weird isms that philosophy adores, who are beginning to give up on mechanism and materialism and started to embrace panpsychism or panentheism or idealism and so on. Consciousness is a word that I associate with those kinds of isms because it sounds a bit more sort of scientific somehow, consciousness. But I've never really been able to attach the same kind of meaning. It's too, for me, it's too abstract. Consciousness to me simply means my mundane awareness. I might say, well, I believe in expansion of consciousness, whereby, you know, one might suddenly have a greater awareness, a sort of mystical awareness. For instance, people have mystical experiences of nature in which suddenly they see everything absolutely vibrant, living and interconnected, and they're part of nature, all interconnected together. This is like Wordsworth's primordial vision of nature. And that can happen, and often does, to just ordinary people, especially gardeners. But so I'm sure that consciousness is the same idea, but for me, it's another reinvention of the wheel, really. I just prefer the symbolism of older words like soul and imagination, which have more depth and resonance for me than the word consciousness. When you talk to someone like Rupert Sheldrake, who thinks that everything in the universe has a kind of consciousness, including the sun, for instance, you know, including natural objects, even perhaps rocks have a kind of consciousness. I see that as an iteration of the soul of the world, which I find just more congenial because the word soul, you can't define it. It's a symbol. It has these marvelous connotations of religiousness, sacredness, imaginativeness, all those resonances which speak to me more than the word consciousness does. But so the difference may well just be sort of a semantic quibbling. I don't know.
Yeah, but Jung was already on it, you know, with his unconscious, conscious, subconsciousness, and so forth.
Yes,
So
yes.
he already started it, actually, not a modern scientist who went off. Thanks God they do, by the way.
That's true. That's true. And you know, he thought you should try and make the contents of the unconscious as conscious as possible. And that's true. I would just talk about the expansion of the imagination. No, I found Jung incredibly useful. He was an absolutely key figure. As you can tell, every page of my book has a kind of Jungian thinking. It was one of my ways into the golden chain. But when he led me back, as did Yeats led me back through one strand, through my study of, you know, I read English at university, so I was conversant with poetry and drama and so on. But Jung led me into the more esoteric philosophies, Hermetic philosophy, alchemy, neoplatonism, and so on. But Jung and Yeats have so much in common. You know, what Jung called archetypes, Yeats called symbols, but his symbols were archetypal, just as Jung's archetypes, which you can't know in themselves, paradoxically can be known because they manifest as images, as symbols. So they had a lot in common, but there is a sort of perhaps perennial soul of the world philosophy, which has to be interpreted in every generation in the language and terms of each generation. But I'm not sure that things progress or change that much. I think we just reiterate the same thing. To return to the peculiar eccentricity of the modern mindset, which is so literal-minded that it constantly drives to literalize what used to be imaginative and mythic. Flying is common in myth, but no, we have to literalize that. We have to invent aeroplanes. The idea of the other world of fairyland, which is real to all indigenous tribal cultures, traditional cultures, where as the Irish say, the Irish fairies cast glamour over the world. You know, that's the word for, they enchant the world with their glamour. Well, now that's been literalized by films and television. You know, we look through a portal into another world where little people do marvelous things. And just being in that world imparts a sort of glamour. If friends of mine appear on television, I look at them differently. They have a sort of luster about them suddenly. I don't know why, but everybody knows that. Everybody knows that if you've been on telly, no matter how appalling you are, you're suddenly newsworthy. You have a kind of a glamour, you know, that sort of thing. The shaman looks into you and discerns the cause of evil. We invent X-rays and so on. Mind-altering substances are taken to have visions. Medicine's 90% drugs. You can see a lot of pure technology as being literalizations of very, very old ideas. The idea of I don't know, the internet was clearly invented by Hermes. Hermes is the only god that can travel from the sky to the earth to the underworld. So his trajectory is one of depth, of verticality. And if you deny him his depth, which we do, because we've done away with the underworld and the sky world, you know, in our worldview, then he's forced to become horizontal. He's the god of communication. So he girdles the earth, as Shakespeare said, Puck did in 40 minutes. He girdles the earth in ever faster communications. So I would say he was the god, the myth behind the internet, in which we all participate like the soul of the world at our separate individual terminals. This might sound fanciful, but I'm not sure. I think there's a lot of literalizing of myth going on in the modern technological world.
Yeah, conscious, unconscious consciousness, all this terminology, but you said it yourself in your own book. Yeah. The Philosopher's Secret Fire, you said the objective or the goal you pursue in this book is actually to answer the question how the unconscious arose. And have you answered that question?
Well, the answer is the change in our way of thinking at the scientific revolution. Let's say around 1600, when our modern worldview began to emerge with empiricism and rationalism, and the dominance of what Ian McGilchrist would call left brain thinking. The dominance of what the depth psychologists will call the rational ego, more or less the same thing. And this is a very powerful, it's a part of the psyche, the ego. It's part of the soul. But when it becomes too focused, too narrow, too objective, over-rational, you might say, then it casts the other parts of the psyche into shadow. That it denies imagination and it denies soul. These are the early casualties of the rise of the rational ego, which was incredibly powerful because it began to probe nature, investigate nature. It began to produce technologies. It invented the telescope. Galileo's telescope swapped poetic vision for magnified eyesight. So I think it was the notion of the unconscious was sort of unknown before the rise of the rational heroic ego, as it's sometimes called, which strangely insisted that it was the whole of the psyche. And so bright was its spotlight that everything else was cast into shadow, whereas before we had no concept of this kind of consciousness being divided from the unconscious. We were just whole psyches, that we were whole souls who participated in the world. We didn't step back from it. We weren't objective in that way, but the determination of the rational ego to step back from the world and to examine it objectively, empirically, and so on, meant that we lost this participation in the world, this sense of affinity, the old system of sympathy and correspondence was lost. And so I think that the rise of that kind of ego, that kind of, or the predominance of left brain thinking, as it were, created the unconscious, which, like all dynamic, imaginative, daimonic systems, reasserted itself. I explained how it reasserted itself in the craze for spiritualism, but it also reasserted itself in the psychoanalysts' consulting rooms. All of a sudden, the unconscious lives of people that had been so long repressed began to cry out with alien voices from Freud's couch and so on. As Jung always kept saying, the gods became diseases, The reintegration of the unconscious into consciousness is really just, the recovery of a more holistic, imaginative view of the world as sacred and ensouled, that we have to cultivate that sense of poetry, and the arts are very important in this, obviously, and religion too. We have to be more religious. We have to be, and I think that we are. I think that we're not just Homo sapiens. I think we're Homo religiosus. I think there is within us all a nostalgia, on the one hand, for something in the past, which is probably our divine life before birth, and also a drive towards some future divinity, a sort of utopian desire for union with the Godhead. And that sort of innate religious kind of disposition gets distorted and twisted and projected onto the wrong things, but I think it's probably there, if Plato is to be credited, not to mention Jesus.
And if I had to explain the daimonic realm using rational, what we know, thinking about our material world, I would say that all these apparitions, the UFOs, the fairies, and whatever visions and strange things, that poltergeist, you named, right? Abductions, it's because the range of our senses is quite limited. Even if you compare it to insects or other animals. Theoretically, I could say that it's just because I cannot see them in my normal state, let's say that, right, of consciousness or being, or whatever you call it, awareness, is because I fall within the natural range of my senses. But the moment we do expand that, we should be able to see that world. So that world exists simply because we are not equipped to see it or interact with it. And therefore, then I think, okay, if that's the case, and there are several little worlds which exist simultaneously around us, we don't see them, but they're just here right now, right, in my room. Then our reality, our world, is a sort of a multi-layered thing, or I would say it's an interlaced world of multiple realms, right? That sort of thing. Would you subscribe to that idea? What would you say to that?
Using that example, all you'd get was an extension of the same literal world. You just hear higher or lower frequencies, or you'd be able to see ultraviolet and infrared, for instance, but these would still be at the same level on the same spectrum, as it were. It would certainly extend our sensual range, mm-hmm. But I don't think it would have much to say about our imaginative range. That's all I'd say, really. That kind of description just extends literalism, much in the same way that a telescope extends the number of things in the universe. It doesn't essentially alter our vision of the cosmos. We just add more stars and more galaxies, and the scientists invite us to be filled with wonder and awe at these ever-increasing numbers. But numbers don't fill us with awe, they just numb us, because a million is much the same as 10 million or 100 million or a billion. And that's why our universe is unsatisfactory. It's not a proper macrocosm in the sense of, it's vastly inferior to the medieval concept of the cosmos as a series of wonderful spheres moving, each emitting a note and moving in musical harmony, which is vast, yes, but not vast like our universe, because it is finite in the end, so it's more like looking at a great cathedral than at this sort of ever receding, emptier and emptier space, this awful darkness. Poor old Pascal was one of the first people to get a whiff of that, of the modern worldview, and he said the thought of these infinite spaces terrifies me, and so on. And scientists themselves talk about a universe that is hostile, or at best indifferent. They don't notice that they're using anthropomorphic, personified language. If the universe is, as they say, an objective, inert place, it couldn't possibly be hostile or indifferent. That's why I think our modern cosmology is unsatisfactory. It's no good telling me that these are the facts. The way in which you investigate, the cosmos is shape-shifting. It's an imaginative realm. The way in which we investigate it or imagine it is reflected back to us in the cosmos itself. And so we get the cosmos that we deserve. The more we deny the soul to the cosmos, the more soulless it becomes. It just becomes this ever bigger and bigger space,
We had to blame
I think you can choose other cosmoses to inhabit, that's what I'm saying. You can choose a cosmos which is harmonious and beautiful and filled with daimons and gods, persons, presences. Although even then, there's a kind of personification of even of the frightful modern cosmos, white dwarfs, red giants, we can't help but personify these things.
Well,
and the black hole becomes, the symbol of everything, becomes a symbol of the awful darkness at the heart of modern cosmology. The reality of black holes is both mythic and literal, but it's more mythic than literal, I think. But it's a way of it's a kind of anti-cosmos, in the way that science is anti-imagination.
You write about the soul in the Philosopher's Secret Fire. You write that the primary cause of illness in traditional societies is loss of soul. And I should add to that, you also state that while in Western societies, we seem to have lost the realm of soul, the deeper self. What do you mean by that? What do you think is the cause of it? And how can we cure it, if we can?
I think we just deny the soul dimensions to things, the things that this very vague thing called soul, which is in a sense nothing in itself, but is at the same time produces all the images of everything that there is. If we lose that principle, well, what can I say? I mean, the orthodox modern scientific materialistic worldview denies soul to the world, and we see the results. We see the worldview that it's produced, and to emphasize rationality at all costs cuts us off from our soul. There's a psychiatric condition called depersonalization, in which the world just seems suddenly two-dimensional. It's the opposite of the kind of poetic vision. It's a condition that is a form of imagination that is without imagination. The world just seems grey, weary, stale, flattened, and unprofitable, as Hamlet says. And that, I think, is a condition that means that you've lost contact with your own soul, with your innermost life, and so on. And what bothers me is that it sounds very much like the worldview held by scientism, not scientists who are all marvelous people, but the ideology of scientism kind of endorses that depersonalized view of the world, which has been drained of soul, of depth, of meaning, of imaginative vitality. And it bothers me that might be just becoming our way of life, that it is so difficult for us to summon up our own souls, our own imaginative power to re-enchant the world, to reinvigorate it with soul, and to re-enchant it. That's what I'd say about that.
What can we do about it? Can we?
Perhaps the way forward to begin with is through beauty. That is the chief attribute of the soul, traditionally. The three great forms that Plato emphasizes are the good, the true, and the beautiful. And perhaps the good is perhaps above even the most important. Chief attribute of soul is beautiful. And I think to attend to beauty wherever we can, create beauty wherever we can, is a way of re-enchanting the world, getting back this sense of depth and meaning that we have all too often lost. Yes, but beauty might be the first way in, not just in terms of making beautiful objects as in art or in writing or something, but in our everyday lives, just the way we decorate our rooms, the way we attend to our gardens, the way we adorn ourselves, anything really, anything that increases the sum of beauty in the world is a way of bringing back the soul of the world, I think, or allowing it to manifest itself again, because of course it doesn't go away, it's all there. It's a question of how we perceive it, so it's the way we attend to the world carefully, lovingly, sympathetically. That's perhaps the key, and it's quite a difficult discipline to do, but necessary. One of the things that bothers me most is how we've neglected young people. That there is no society in the past, or even in the present amongst traditional society, which don't have initiation rites of passage. Even the Christian church kind of recognized them in the ceremonies of christening, birth, confirmation, puberty, marriage, and death. These are the four main stages. We just don't have, for instance, puberty rites anymore. And all societies have recognized that simple biological change isn't enough. It has to be accompanied by elaborate ceremonies, elaborate rituals, which are like the inside of biological change, which are the soul of biological change. That is to say, psychic transformation. That our lives are a series of deaths and rebirths, the death of the child and the rebirth into the adult, the death of the solitary person into a married couple, the biological death and rebirth into the next life. So, death and rebirth are these absolutely necessary cyclical events that have to occur, and they have to be marked by ceremonies. And because that's how we get to know things. We don't get to know things by just cognition, by learning facts. We get to know things by being initiated into them. Initiation is a gnostic way of knowing,
Inner knowing.
Existential, engaged, imaginative knowing that we feel in our bones. That's what we need, And to just cast pubescent children adrift, if we don't initiate them, they'll do it themselves. They'll form initiation groups, gangs. They'll have tattoos and piercings and strict rules about honor and fighting. They're not sent out to hunt a leopard, which is a traditional kind of initiation rite. No, they'll hunt other gangs. They want something, they're spoiling for a fight because they want to know who they are. So I think, if I were supreme ruler, I would reintroduce initiation rites for young people. We could invent some new ones, but they would have a lot of traditional. There'd be a lot of dancing, be a lot of singing, there'd be a lot of bonfires, some element of hardship, of adventure, of danger, of risk, is necessary, because otherwise people, they don't know who they are. They've got to learn that they are self-reliant, strong, adult. What the degree of that hardship is, I don't know, and we can argue about that. That's just a thought. I just feel strongly that something must be done for, for children. That there's another side to education, and that's really bringing something out of these children that they don't know is there. I think we should just learn a few lessons from traditional cultures in this matter. That's all I'm saying.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for taking the time and
I love
talking to me.
it.
It's good.
I totally enjoyed it.